I've been waiting for this for a long time. We're going to cut taxes for the middle class, make the tax code simpler and more fair for everyday Americans, and we are going to bring back the jobs and wealth that have left our country, and most people thought left our country for good.
Welcome to the Journal Editorial Report. I'm Paul Gigot. That was President Donald Trump this week in Indianapolis, touting the Republicans' long-awaited blueprint for overhauling the U.S. tax code. Details of the plan released Wednesday include reducing individual tax brackets from 7 to 3, doubling the standard deduction for individuals and married couples, and eliminating the so-called death tax. But the linchpin is a reduction of the corporate tax rate from 35 to 20%, a provision the president has called non-negotiable. Former Texas Senator Phil Gramm was chair of the Senate Banking Committee. He's now a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Welcome, Senator. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Paul.
So as you look at this plan, how good is it, do you think, in terms of helping the economy?
I think it's very good in terms of helping the economy. I think with what we're doing legislatively, through rulemaking, through executive order, and lessening regulatory burden, that the adoption of this plan would pretty much guarantee that we would return to 3% plus growth, which would mean more jobs, better jobs, higher paying jobs, and of course the government would get $2.2 trillion in new revenues. So economically, I think the plan is right, and I think politically, it's very strong because it's exactly what Republicans promised in the campaign they would do. And voters don't like to be surprised. They don't like it when you say, I'm going to do something, and then you turn around and do something else. So I'm very pleased with the outline.
All right. And is from an economic growth point of view, the big changes seem to be the cut in the corporate tax rate from 35 to 20, the cut in the business tax rate for pass-through subchapter S companies, that goes down to 25. Are those two the key growth provisions in your view?
Well, they're very important, but I think there are two other provisions that could be even more important. Territorial treatment for foreign earnings will mean that American companies can be competitive abroad.
Right.
And it means that they're going to bring back vast amounts of money to the United States that can be invested here. I think repealing the death tax is a big issue economically. You've got a lot of people that have small businesses. They are tired of running the business, but they're afraid to sell it because they'll have to pay a big capital gains tax, and then when they die, they'll have to pay a death tax. So you've got all these assets frozen. You're going to open those up if this bill becomes law, and I think the economic growth impact of that is grossly underestimated.
That's interesting because the rap on the death tax is typically, well, the only people who pay that, 2% of estates pay that, so it only goes to the wealthiest people. You're saying that, in fact, I mean, I guess this is true if you look at the evidence. The wealthy, Warren Buffett, they'll create their own foundations and never pay the tax. It's the rancher, the small business person, the person who builds up a more modest portfolio who ends up paying for it.
Yeah, what happens is people build up assets, they build up a successful farm, a successful business, and then they get to the age where they don't want to run it, they're not doing a terribly good job at it, but they can't afford to sell it. And so you get assets that are misused, it affects economic growth, and if you let them sell it, they pay capital gains tax on it, so you're going to gain revenues immediately. But more importantly, you're going to get businesses in the hands of people who want to run them. And look, nobody except a very small group of redistributionists is in favor of the death tax. People work all their lives, build up assets, a business, then you come in and tax them again when they die. I would say 80% of the American people are not for that tax.
All right. Now let's talk about the individual tax rate, particularly at the top, because as you know, I mean, they say in the outline they're going to reduce it from 39.6 to 35, but behind the scenes, they're really talking about maybe no cut in the rate at all. Is that a mistake? And will that hurt growth?
Yeah, I think it's a mistake. Yeah, I think it hurts growth. I have a hard time differentiating the rate people ought to pay based on how they earn their income myself. So did Reagan. But look, we're talking about trying to do this so that we don't change the distribution of the tax burden, but Obama changed the distribution of the tax burden. He imposed income tax increases only on high-income individuals, and he raised the capital gains tax and the dividend tax 59%. So I think if we're going to be neutral in effect on distribution of the tax burden, it ought to be pre-Obama, not post-Obama.
Yeah.
Do we have to enshrine what Obama did in the tax code until Jesus comes back? I don't think so.
I'm with you, Senator, on that one, and on just about everything else. But I want to ask you about this deficit charge, because a lot of people are saying, hey, this is going to increase the deficit. There's no plan right now in the details to pay for this, to finance the rate cuts. You're a spending hawk. You've been a deficit hawk all your career. What do you make of that charge?
Well, first of all, where in the hell were these people when Obama doubled the outstanding debt of the country in 8 years? Where were they then? Secondly, the Reagan tax cut actually raised revenues by 19% by the time Reagan left office, even though it broke the back of inflation and indexed the tax code for inflation. So I think the evidence is that this can, and I believe it will work. And I think, secondly, we can never deal with a deficit with a weak economy. If we're going to have a European economy, we're going to have European debt and we're going to have European taxes. And also remember, Obama raised taxes on high-income individuals. He was going to get $690 billion over 10 years. Well, what happened? Well, what happened is we ended up with slow growth, and so we lost $3.2 trillion in revenues.
And with faster growth from 2% to 3%, we'll get a lot more of that back. Thank you, Senator, for being here.
Oh, thank you, Paul.
Still ahead, as the GOP gears up for the coming tax fight on Capitol Hill, can the party stick together and get a bill to President Trump's desk before the end of the year?
This is a now or never moment. The choice before us is really clear. We can succumb to the talking heads on TV and the special interests who want to maintain the status quo, or we can work together to seize this moment and do what the American people sent us here to do.
That was House Speaker Paul Ryan Wednesday calling the GOP push to overhaul the tax code a now or never moment. But for vulnerable Republicans facing re-election in 2018, it could be a do-or-die moment as well as they look for a legislative achievement to run on. So can Congress deliver a bill to President Trump's desk by year's end? Let's ask Wall Street Journal columnist and deputy editor Dan Henninger, editorial page writer Kate Batchelder-Odell, and columnist James Freeman and Mary Anastasia O'Grady. So, Kate, you've been digging into this for the last couple of weeks. Do you share Senator Graham's enthusiasm for the plan?
I do, but I will add one caveat, which is that basically Republicans have come up with a consensus document, but it means that they can't afford to give in to this or that interest group. And already we're seeing some pushback from realtors, from the redistributionists of the right who want bigger family credits, and the different factions of the party are going to have to hang tough and hang together.
So you're saying that if the rates where they are, the cuts in the rates where they are, is a good plan. The danger is that it will erode as the political process moves ahead.
That's true. I mean, most of the growth element is on the business side, as we discussed earlier. But basically, on the personal side, they want to keep the tax code at least as progressive as it is. They say this explicitly. That's a disappointment.
Right, because means it's basically enshrining the progressivity of Barack Obama.
That's right. And the tax code has gotten so much more progressive since the 1986 reform. Basically, even as rates have gone up at the top, bigger refundable tax credits at the bottom have made the code code a lot more progressive.
Yeah, Mary, when Reagan in '86 got the reform done, the top rate was 28. This is, right now it's about 44 if you include bells and whistles and deduction phase outs and the surcharges. If it only goes down to 39.6, you know, no, great.
Right. Right, but don't tell the Democrats that. They're already out there making this an issue of class warfare. That's a big talking point of Chuck Schumer.
But even some right-wing intellectuals are doing that.
Yeah, and on the Republican side, what I fear is that you have a lot of Republicans in high tax states that are also going to push back against this. People like Peter King and Dan Donovan in New York. You know, in Manhattan, on the island of Manhattan alone, the average of claims is like $25,000. And people won't give that up easily, and they will ask their state representatives to fight for it.
And yet, James, that's worth $1.25 trillion or so over 10 years, that state and local tax deduction to finance lower rates. You take that out, you don't get lower rates.
No, and it's a good reform, even though it's going to hurt people like us temporarily. What it does is it creates a big incentive for these high tax, poorly run states like the ones we live in to reform. It really, I think that it also, you look at the big picture, this is about growing the economy. It's about getting out of the sort of Obama-era slump that we're still bumping along. And the second quarter was good, but we got to sustain it. And I think that really is what they need to focus on. How do you grow jobs?
So, Dan, where do you see the political vulnerabilities to getting this through Congress? Obviously, you got the class war issue. You've got this special interest issue. Any others?
Yeah, I would say the egocentricity of the United States Senate is your biggest problem, Paul. You know,
who are you talking about when you talk about egos, or is it all 52 Republicans?
Well, we'll get to them in a second. But, you know, with the health care bill, that began to get into trouble in the House when the House Freedom Caucus began to raise objections. I talked to the chairman of the House Freedom Caucus, Mark Meadows, down here in Washington this week, and he said he thought they were going to be okay with the tax bill. They were going to get it done. So I don't see the big problems coming out of the House this time. But you go over into the Senate, and what happened to the health care bill with Senators McCain and Rand Paul, Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, there is something about these senators who just don't feel like they want to win, that they have to express themselves more for reasons of their own egos than actually getting a bill done. Now, you've got Senator Marco Rubio and Mike Lee already proposing to double the child tax credit, which could really throw a spanner into this bill because it completely disrupts the calculations they've made to make the bill work out all right. So I would say that's just the beginning in the Senate, and it is going to be a real test for the Republicans to see if they can get these senators to pass a piece of tax legislation.
Kate, what's wrong with this child tax credit proposal?
Well, we don't know much about it yet, but the current tax credit is $1,000 and it is refundable, and which means that basically if you have no tax liability, you get a check from the feds. It's spending in the tax code,
right?
And that's what it will be whenever we're done with this political exercise, is more spending through the tax code.
But it's also very expensive, isn't it? As you're talking about $1 trillion again in a payout to people who have children. It's a form of redistribution through the tax code.
Right. It's a straight subsidy, and what it does is it prevents you from deeper rate cuts that produce the economic growth that parents and families want.
And the problem, as Kate is laid out, is that politically it will be, the Democrats will be spinning this as corporations are getting this big
tax cut,
subsidy from the government, and so therefore people with children should get it. That's how it's going to be told.
But if you look at the economic evidence, Mary, and you know this because you look at it a lot, the benefits of a rate cut flow to workers. I mean, shareholders get some, but they flow to workers in higher salaries.
That's why I think it's so important for the president and the Republicans to talk about this in terms of growth, in terms of more investment and more jobs for people, because that's in fact, what the goal is. It has nothing to do with, this redistribution picture.
And the president has said that corporate rate is not going higher than 20. That is crucial that they don't buckle on that, because when you throw in the state taxes, we're still going to be above the average in Europe. We're still going to be above the average in Asia. I think we're going to be competitive enough. This is good news. But if they let that corporate rate go higher than 20, you start wondering, is this going to be the big growth driver?
Because the average state corporate tax is about 4%,
right.
So that's 24. Okay, thank you all. When we come back, as HHS Secretary Tom Price resigns, a look at what his ouster means for future efforts to repeal and replace Obamacare.
Long before the November election, we're going to have a vote, and we're going to be able to get that through.
Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price resigned late Friday amid the media frenzy over his use of private jets for government travel. This as the Republican promise to repeal and replace Obamacare suffers another setback, with Republican leaders abandoning a plan by Senators Lindsey Graham and Bill Cassidy this week that would have allowed them to pass the legislation with just 51 votes. We're back with Dan Henninger and James Freeman. So first, Tom Price, Dan, he's out. What's behind this?
Well, what's behind it, nominally anyway, is the fact that he was using private jets and perhaps government jets as well for both official use and private use. And it isn't just Tom Price who has done this. There's been members of the cabinets of both this administration, perhaps, and Obama's administration who have done it as well. In 2013, Senator Grassley released a Government Accountability Office report that noted that Eric Holder, then the Attorney General, and of all people, Robert Mueller, former FBI director, now the special prosecutor, himself engaged in this sort of practice, reimbursing the government at some sort of set rate. So that is basically what Tom Price did. And
okay, but now it sounds like this is a new standard. I mean, these other people weren't disqualified for doing that. Why Tom Price?
Well, because Tom Price is Donald Trump's HHS secretary, and Trump promised to drain the swamp. And in some sense, this is part of the swamp. The question is whether Trump threw him over the side too quickly, because Trump has, puts distance between any member of his government and him that causes him any problem. And do remember that even the past week, there have been stories that Trump is now trying to push Attorney General Jeff Sessions out. He's still angry at him for not recusing over the Russian probe. So there's a kind of tense relationship between Donald Trump and his own cabinet.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he should have made himself a target by taking these trips. On the other hand, I'm told that he had counsel from inside HHS, people telling him, look, this is okay. So, I mean, and it is, what do you think?
Yeah, doing anything in government, including dialing up a private jet, there are going to be a lot of people involved, probably some ethics opinions, probably a lot of paperwork, and this is a common practice. A lot of people might wish if they were going to make an example of someone, it would have been, you mentioned Eric Holder after he took his family up to the Belmont Stakes in New York here. It's a lovely horse race, I'm sure, but they end up reimbursing just a fraction of what it actually costs to fly everyone up there. But as you say, I think if you're in the Trump cabinet, you have to understand both that the media is at war with Donald Trump, so it's going to be a bigger deal than it is going to be with an Obama administration. But also you have to understand that there is a tendency of people in these positions not to last very long. He's got a quick trigger finger.
But you want to know something? I don't think this really is the reason. I think the reason that he fired him is he and Price never meshed. The president never meshed on a personal basis. That's very important with this guy. And he blames him for the failure of Obamacare. Well, Price came from the House. People said, Mr. President, he can help you sell this to the House and the Senate. And he didn't get it done. And Trump doesn't say, it was my fault. Sorry. No, he says, your fault. You're out.
But I think James made a very good point, which is that this story originated in Politico. The press, the Beltway press, is at war with Donald Trump, as are the Democrats. And this is going to be used, this argument, as another wedge to drive between the Trump administration internally and between Donald Trump and the Republican Party and inside the Republican Party. I mean, we go back to that Alabama election where you had the Republican Party divided, and this is just not helping the Trump presidency.
What about reviving the repeal and replace move, James? You have the president this week saying, well, we can get this done next week. He's even said we have the votes. He doesn't have them the way I'm counting them, but is there any chance of that?
I think probably it is going to be a little tougher now. I guess if it's true that the president, if you're correct that the president got rid of Tom Price because he thought he was failing on this, I think that's a miscalculation. I think Price has really been a very positive force both in this job and in his previous job in terms of health policy. But in terms of looking at the votes now, no, I don't think he's there yet. But he is close, and I think they knew that this week. I wouldn't rule it out that it happens, and I don't think, while it's a setback not having Price, I don't think we should assume now that it can't happen in the first few months of next year.
Here's the key for a replacement. Tom Price knows the law, the Affordable Care Act.
Right.
He knows the waiver authority that the executive has, and it's extensive. And Trump has to have somebody in that job who understands that authority, understands what he can do. Otherwise, you're going to have these exchanges in the states deteriorate even more. So he's got to have a replacement who knows the traps, can work the bureaucracy. Otherwise, it's going to be in big trouble.
And a replacement who's willing to take on that job, because at this point, you're basically repairing Obamacare. You're not repealing and replacing it. You're trying to fix the exchanges. And the question is, who out there is willing to come in and basically take over a fix-it job?
Former governor, Senator from Oklahoma, Tom Coburn, maybe FDA Chief Scott Gottlieb, Seema Verma of HHS. Those would be good names. We'll see. Still ahead, the fallout from the GOP's failure to repeal and replace Obamacare already taking its electoral toll. So is Roy Moore's victory in Alabama this week a warning to so-called establishment Republicans?
Together we can make America great. We can support the president. Don't let anybody in the press think that because he supported my opponent that I do not support him and support his agenda.
That was former state Supreme Court Justice Roy Moore following his victory Tuesday in the Republican primary runoff to fill Attorney General Jeff Sessions' Alabama Senate seat. Mr. Moore's 10-point rout over Senator Luther Strange is widely seen as a warning to Republicans in Washington. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell's Political Action Committee spent heavily for Strange, and President Trump and Vice President Pence both campaigned for him in the last week of the campaign. We're back with Dan Henninger, Jason Riley, and James Freeman. So, Jason, is this a defeat for the so-called establishment Washington Republicans?
Yes. Oh, I think that is clear, Paul. And to some extent, it's a defeat for Donald Trump. He picked the wrong horse here. I think it's also evidence that Trumpism might be bigger than Trump. In that sense, and I think that the style of politician that Roy Moore is something that is ascendant in this country, and that too scares the establishment Republicans. This sort of attitude that everyone is corrupt in Washington. I mean, the idea that you could run against a Luther Strange the way Roy Moore did and characterize him the way he did, it was quite amazing. I mean that to me was one of the bigger takeaways.
Yeah, on policy. Is not much different between the two, but it was an attitude thing. He's the outsider. He's and if you ask me, James, and I wonder if you agree, I think the failure of Obamacare repeal, particularly the second round, coming right ahead of the election, basically it played right into Moore's argument. They can't get anything done. You need somebody else. And so John McCain, Susan Collins, Rand Paul, man, they might as well have been campaign managers for Roy Moore. Yeah,
if voters wanted to send a message that they're ticked off that Republicans with control of Congress have not been able to get anything done, I think anyone would say they've got a legitimate gripe here. I'm not sure I'd read too much into this. I like Big Luther. I think he would have been continue to be a good senator, but I'm not sure he had really carved out, really had the time to carve out much of an identity with the voters of Alabama.
He was an appointed senator.
Yes. Okay. And whereas Roy Moore, well, obviously a lot of questions about his methods in terms of defying federal court orders, I think he had built an identity in the state for years as a guy standing up for traditional values, and for a lot of voters who feel like religion has been pushed out of the public square, this is a guy who was kind of shoving it back in, and I think that did cheer a lot of people.
Dan, but in Roy Moore, are Alabama Republicans sending, assuming he wins the general on December 12th, are they sending somebody who could be as difficult to corral for a vote as Rand Paul?
Absolutely. I think Roy Moore could be a very difficult vote. And I think something significant happened down there, Paul. I mean, President Trump, Donald Trump, went to Alabama and campaigned hard for Luther Strange. But Steve Bannon, who until recently was his chief political advisor in the White House, Steve Bannon went to Alabama and campaigned for Judge Moore against Donald Trump. Sarah Palin went to Alabama and campaigned for Judge Moore. And I think what you're beginning to see is the emergence of a populist party inside the Republican Party. It's always been there, but I think the Bannon activity makes it clear that this is being formalized inside the Republican Party, and they intend to challenge what they call the establishment. And if Donald Trump is standing in their way, they're going to campaign against him as well. So Jason had a point there. Trump was being overtaken by Trumpism, and the question is, what are the Republicans in Washington going to do if they have this group at their back constantly trying to call them to account?
All right, well, here's what I would do. I would get things done. I would pass tax reform. I would fulfill your promises on health care. Yeah. I would confirm judges.
And having more might make that more difficult, frankly. He's a wild card, and you don't have a lot of wiggle room. You only have 52 votes. The other people that were paying attention to what happened in this election are people like Jeff Flake in Arizona, people like Dean Heller in Nevada.
They both have primary challengers already.
And I think you're going to see more of those challengers coming out of the Bannon wing of the party against the establishment. So yes, Mitch McConnell's job might have just gotten a lot harder.
Well, and what they're going to do with these challenges, James, is they're going to force the Republican incumbent senators to spend the money that they could be spending, the party could be spending to defeat Democratic incumbents on these primary races. So you're going to have, I think, a lot more vulnerable Republican incumbents who have to defend their standing, and a lot fewer Democratic incumbents who will have challengers who can beat them.
Yeah, but some of these challengers, I like Jeff Flake a lot, but I think you have to ask, why did he spend so much time even writing a book attacking the president? You look at the record, so little achievement this year in the Congress. Maybe their time should have been more focused on putting some points on the board.
In defense of Flake, he voted for Obama.
Yeah, no,
he's going to be great on taxes. He's good on spending. Yep. You know, the big difference he has with Trump is on immigration.
That's right.
So I mean, you know, but I guess that's going to be litigated.
One more thing, if you want to look at Alabama as a healthy sign, this is not a cult of personality for Donald Trump. Obviously, voters make up their own minds, and his endorsement doesn't pull everyone in his coalition automatically behind it.
All right, still ahead. Amid criticism of its response to Hurricane Maria, the Trump administration steps up its recovery efforts in storm-ravaged Puerto Rico. We'll look at the challenges that lie ahead next. Under fire for what critics say was a slow response to the crisis in Puerto Rico, the Trump administration this week stepped up its efforts to bring aid to the island, which was devastated by Hurricane Maria last week. The Pentagon has appointed Lieutenant General Jeffrey Buchanan to oversee the federal recovery effort. And on Thursday, the White House authorized a 10-day waiver of the Jones Act, a federal law that limits shipping to U.S. ports by foreign vessels. Puerto Rico's governor requested the waiver, arguing that it would expedite the shipment of much-needed supplies to storm-ravaged areas. President Trump is scheduled to visit Puerto Rico next week. We're back with Wall Street Journal columnist Mary Anastasia O'Grady. So, Mary, how dire is the situation there?
Well, Paul, it was a really forceful hurricane, and it was a direct hit on Puerto Rico, 155-mile-an-hour winds, hitting an electricity grid that was already extremely vulnerable, very old and fragile. And as a result, basically the island lost all electricity, and it also had a lot of downed trees, so roads were not passable and so forth. And this was a humanitarian crisis for the first at least 10 days because it meant that there was no electricity for the elderly and the sick. So hospitals in particular, people who needed dialysis treatment, people who needed insulin, which has to be refrigerated. That was where the real humanitarian crisis was in the first 10 days.
What about food and water shortages? Are those being alleviated as we speak?
Well, again, this had largely to do with electricity because, for example, the water, there's about 45% of the water that the island that was without potable water in the first 10 days. Those people were dependent on electricity to pump the water. That was the problem. And FEMA had a plan in place in which they would use generators, but they did not have a good plan in place for getting the diesel to the trucks and getting the trucks out to deliver the diesel to the generators.
All right. How do you explain, other than downed trees and roads and that sort of thing, how do you explain this distribution issue? We've seen, the containers on the photos of the containers in the ports.
Yes.
And not being able to move the products and the relief goods into the island.
Well, again, this had to do with gasoline and diesel, and it also had to do with truck drivers. But I think one of the things that FEMA really failed on, and I don't think that the president didn't pay attention to Puerto Rico, but I think FEMA's plan, whatever that was, failed. The head of FEMA, local on the island, a Puerto Rican, said in the middle of last week, we don't understand why the private contractors that we've hired to deliver the diesel are not delivering the diesel. Well, I mean, if you're an emergency management agency, you should be on top of the diesel getting delivered because that was essential to maintaining some kind of energy on the island.
Now, the Trump later this week has decided to essentially put a general there and get the U.S. military involved. Is this something you think needs to be done?
Yeah, I think it's going to help. I mean, but I still say the execution of the delivery of the diesel, it doesn't matter if it's the military or the locals, they had a real problem in execution. And I think they're breaking that logjam. Truck drivers are showing up. But let's face it, the truck drivers couldn't communicate with the emergency centers because the cell towers were down. There was very little cell coverage on the island except for near San Juan and in the center of the island.
If you compare this to Florida and Texas, it really sounds like a lot of this is just the essential poverty of the island. The island is just that much more vulnerable because its electrical grid was more vulnerable, and the cell towers weren't as reinforced as they were on the mainland.
Yeah, I think when you have a political class like you do in Puerto Rico that has not managed, has not done its job basically, provide basic services and to protect people against these kinds of vulnerabilities. When you have a Cat 4 hurricane hit, all of that is going to be exposed, and that's what we're seeing right now.
So what can the United States do to help Puerto Rico so 15 years from now it won't be like this?
Well, I'm not so sure. I mean, it's going to have to, it's going to require the Puerto Ricans to really decide that they want to demand more of their politicians. I mean, there's a big debt overhang. A lot of that debt will be, those debtors will be haircutted. They will lose money. But I think there has to be some kind of a social contract that says, look, we're going to get help, but in return, we're going to be more responsible in terms of our accountability.
Make it an enterprise zone. All right, thanks, Mary. When we come back, our panel weighs in on who wins and who loses in President Trump brawl with the National Football League.
I think they're afraid of their players, you want to know the truth, and I think it's disgraceful.